Good afternoon. My name is Jim Blando, and I'm a faculty member at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. As part of our modules on an overview of exposure and risk management, we're going to talk in this module about specific control strategies and how we select different control strategies and how we might implement them. One of the first things that we like to point out, and there are several sort of theoretical models that people tend to think about how we implement controls, but one particularly useful model is something that's oftentimes referred to as a hierarchy of controls. This is widely utilized, but especially in occupational health environments and industrial hygiene. But I think it's a good conceptual model for us to think about when we think about how does one select a given control strategy. One of the approaches that we oftentimes utilize is this concept of a hierarchy of controls. There are some controls that are more effective than others. And certainly what we try to do is utilize the most effective control that is possible for us to utilize. The challenge is that sometimes more effective controls might not be practical, or there might be a difficulty in implementing more effective controls, and we have to use perhaps lesser effective controls just for practical or other reasons. So when we think about the hierarchy of controls, we can look at this schematic here on the slide, which is essentially an upside-down triangle, where we have the top of this upside-down triangle with the word elimination in the top band of this triangle being the most effective control. And at the bottom of the triangle, at the point on the bottom, we have PPE, or personal protective equipment, at the bottom, thought to be the least effective control. So what we like to do is we like to select our controls based on this hierarchy of controls. And of course, we try to select the most effective control possible. Certainly, if we look at the top of this diagram, the top of this inverted triangle, and look at elimination and substitution, that can be very effective at controlling hazards. Certainly, if we can eliminate a toxic chemical from our formulation, that may completely eliminate the hazard from that chemical because it's no longer in the product that is being used. However, it is also possible that we might not be able to eliminate that chemical from a given product because there may be no technologically available substitute that can allow the product to be formulated without the original chemical in place. It may result in a product that is not desirable to the consumer. Therefore, you can't necessarily eliminate that given toxic chemical from a given product. As such, although elimination can be very effective and substitution can be very effective, it may not be possible or technologically feasible, or might not be acceptable to the consumer to eliminate or substitute a different chemical in that product formulation. As a result, you may not be able to engage with these more effective controls in the hierarchy, and therefore you have to go to lesser effective controls, but these lesser effective controls might be practical, and you may be able to implement them, right? So for example, you might move to engineering controls, which would be an example of that would be something like an air pollution control device. Rather than emitting air pollutants directly to the atmosphere, I put an engineering control, an air pollution control device in place to remove and capture the air pollutants before they're emitted to the atmosphere. The reason why this tends to be more effective than administrative controls and PPE, which are lower on this inverted triangle, is because engineering controls, once they are installed and operating, they do not necessarily require active participation and are not necessarily influenced by the behavior of people or workers in a given facility. Therefore, if someone is not compliant, it doesn't really matter if someone is not compliant or doesn't believe in a control, because they don't actually have to do anything to get the benefits of those controls, because the engineering, the air pollution control system has already been put in place and is removing the air pollutants without any required behavior by the people of the affected community. Therefore, they can be more effective because you don't have to rely on people to actually implement the controls. However, engineering controls can be fairly expensive, which could make them resource intensive and possibly could impact the viability as an effective control strategy. If engineering controls are not available or too expensive, then we might have to travel further down on this inverted triangle to the next control strategy that, while is less effective, could potentially be more practical and could be implemented more easily and effectively because it's practical. And this includes administrative controls. Administrative controls is essentially changing the way people do their job. An example of this could be reducing the hazard of truck drivers from falling asleep behind the wheel by implementing a policy where they have to take rest breaks and a limit on the amount of time that they can drive. The advantage of that is by changing the way the work is done, it could reduce the risks, control the risks. However, the disadvantage is that it does oftentimes require buy-in, participation, and compliance with the people who are impacted. If I'm going to implement a control where I'm going to restrict the number of hours a truck driver can drive to 8 hours a day and require 8 hours of sleep between shifts, it's going to require that the truck driver actually comply with that policy. And that's where the disadvantage could be, is that sometimes people don't necessarily comply with policies. Similarly, if administrative controls are not possible, I can actually implement personal protective equipment. And personal protective equipment are things that are required for a person in a community or a worker to utilize to protect them from exposure. So an example of personal protective equipment might be gloves that a healthcare provider will wear while examining a patient or doing surgery. In a community, personal protective equipment might include a mask during the COVID pandemic. The challenge with PPE is that this, just like administrative controls, requires compliance from the person utilizing the personal protective equipment. Not only does it require compliance, but it requires education and awareness of how to properly use the equipment. Respirators are commonly used in workplace occupational environments, but respirators have to be worn properly. They have to be fit tested to be sure they fit the individual wearing the respirator. These are all activities that can impact the effectiveness of a control strategy. And this is why PPE is at the bottom of this triangle, considered the least effective. However, there are definitely many scenarios out there where you can't eliminate or substitute. Engineering controls are too expensive, and you can't necessarily change the way somebody does a job. And the only option, therefore, you have is personal protective equipment. So again, we always try to utilize the most effective controls, which are the top of this inverted triangle, elimination and substitution. And then we move on. If those are not practical, we move on to things that perhaps are less effective controls for the reasons we've already stated, but they may be things that are practical or the only thing that's possible. And this is how we think about the hierarchy of controls. This can be also reframed from a total worker health paradigm, which is something from NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And this is essentially the same triangle that you saw in the prior slide with just some different terms. Total worker health paradigms is really the same concept as in the previous slide in the hierarchy of controls. It's analogous to that inverted triangle you saw. However, it focuses a little bit more on social science concepts and tools. Things like eliminate and substitute, of course, are really important. Rather than having engineering controls, you may redesign a process, may redesign an environment. If you think about ergonomics, you may, make sure that people have proper chairs so they don't develop backaches while they're sitting at their offices or their desks. In terms of, rather than having administrative controls, you might try to educate people so that they're aware of wellness, like you should exercise and eat healthy. Therefore, you'll be healthier workers, but you'll also be a healthier person. And then certainly, rather than having personal protective equipment, in this case, you may encourage or incentivize people to live and eat healthy so that you have healthy workers and you also have healthy people. So this is essentially the same idea. Eliminate and substituting hazards are certainly, again, the most effective. Redesign of a workplace, because it doesn't necessarily require active compliance or agreement of an individual, that may be effective. Certainly education can be important, provided that people are paying attention and receptive to the educational messages they're being given. And of course, encouragement can be useful, providing people find the incentive enough for them to actually encourage them to participate. So a similar kind of paradigm, going from most effective to least effective for the reasons that were stated. And we can think about what controls we select for those reasons. Again, as we've talked about elimination and substitution, the hierarchy of controls certainly can be the most effective. One thing is, think about the way our chemists think about green chemistry. Here are the 12 principles from the American Chemistry Society that are significant concepts that people think about when they think about how do we eliminate and substitute, and in particular, how do we do this with the chemicals that make up our products. And here are the 12 principles of green chemistry, and these are pertinent questions that one oftentimes has to ask when we think about eliminating and substituting, because we don't want to actually eliminate a component of a formulation that is necessary for the product to perform well. And we certainly want to be sure that anything we substitute, we want to be sure that what the chemical is that is being substituted is not worse than the original chemical in a given formulation. So that is something that's important for us to be sensitive to. We want to make sure that if we eliminate and substitute, we're actually making things better and controlling the hazards and the exposures rather than making things worse. So certainly green chemistry concepts, I've highlighted in red the ones I want to draw your attention to. All of these make up those principles, but the ones in red are the ones that we think about when we think about green chemistry. For example, prevention is really important. One of the things we want to think about when we think about green chemistry is we certainly want to prevent waste. If there's a way that we can handle our chemicals, that we reduce the amount of waste that we're generating, that is very beneficial, because then that waste does not need to be disposed of and people will not be exposed to that waste. Less hazardous chemical synthesis. If we can figure out ways to make chemicals and make products with safer processes, that is very beneficial. An example of this is in the early days of fluoropolymer synthesis. That process used to be done with extremely high pressures and very high temperatures. The difficulty was, and there were several cases of significant explosions that occurred in that synthetic process simply because of the high temperatures and pressures. And if you lose control of the process, you could have a scenario where you can have a runaway reaction, result in an overpressure, have an explosion. Well, since those 1970s, when those polymers were synthesized that way, in that manner, chemists had figured out a way to use catalysts to be able to produce the same polymers at much lower temperatures and lower pressures, thereby eliminating or reducing the hazard of the process utilized to synthesize these chemicals. So if we can use less hazardous chemical syntheses or processes, that is also a great way to approach producing chemicals in a safer manner, eliminating or substituting the hazard. Certainly designing safer molecules. Today, we have the ability to utilize in silico techniques for us to use computer programs to evaluate different molecules to get some very basic cursory assessment of the potential hazards of a given molecule. So we can utilize those tools to help us design and pick less toxic molecules to put in our various products. Again, reducing the amount of solvents, using safer solvents and auxiliaries meaning things like separation agents or anti-separation agents to prevent products from separating, colors from separating, and so on. But if we reduce the amount of solvent that we use and other chemicals that are necessary in products, that reduces the waste and also reduces the number of chemicals people are exposed to. Certainly, we want our products designed to be degraded because we don't want them to persist in the environment and never degrade. This is particularly important when we think about chemicals that are widely distributed in the environment, like agricultural chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, and the like. In fact, this is why the United States Environmental Protection Agency has this as a requirement of chemicals that are licensed to be used as agricultural chemicals, because they're widely distributed in the environment, but we also don't want them to persist in the environment. So pesticides and herbicides and other agricultural chemicals are designed to degrade in the environment such that they no longer exist after a period of time. That is beneficial because we reduce the persistence of these chemicals in the environment, which tends to make them less hazardous. So if we can substitute or eliminate chemicals that are persistent, things like polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, tend to really persist in the environment and last for a long time. Some of the PFAS, the fluorinated alkyl substances, they can people refer to them as forever chemicals. They have toxic properties and they do not degrade in the environment. If we can substitute those chemicals with other compounds that do degrade in the environment and do not last in the environment, that is beneficial. So if we can eliminate or substitute forever chemicals with other chemicals that degrade, that could be very positive potentially. And certainly we want to design our processes to prevent accidents, as I mentioned with the fluoropolymer synthesis example that I gave earlier. Engineering controls are certainly valuable control strategies that we can put in place. They are in the hierarchy of controls, as you saw in the prior two slides. Certainly, this involves engineering, designing devices to control and reduce exposures and prevent releases to the environment. Advantages: does not need explicit buy-in from stakeholders. Whether people agree or disagree, they can be put in place and prevent those exposures from happening, regardless of whether people believe in them or not. It does not require explicit stakeholder behaviors. It doesn't require that a given stakeholder, person in a community or person at work, does something specific for it to potentially reduce or control the hazard or exposures. If designed properly, can be highly effective, unlikely to interfere with stakeholder activities, which is another benefit. It doesn't interfere with a person at work in a manufacturing plant trying to get their job done. Some of the disadvantages: can be very expensive. It certainly must be designed properly, meaning it oftentimes involves engineers. We have to maintain our controls. Certainly an engineering control that's not maintained and becomes dilapidated and non-functional is not going to be very beneficial to anyone. So we have to have a maintenance program in place to keep them operating. For example, I went to a facility that had bag houses in place, but they never put bags in their bag house to control the air pollutants. So the control device was doing absolutely nothing at preventing the air pollutants from being emitted to the atmosphere. So they obviously must be maintained and operated properly for them to be effective. It is true, one of the disadvantages of engineering controls is typically we're transferring a pollutant from one medium to another, which means we still have to have a final disposition of the contaminant of interest. So for example, if I keep using the example of a bag house. If I utilize a bag house and I collect air pollutants and I remove them from the airstream, they now become a solid waste, and that solid waste now needs to be disposed. Whatever you're doing with the engineering control, the goal is that you will produce something that's less of a hazard, right? So if the air pollutant is a really significant hazard and I remove it from the air, hopefully I end up with solid waste that is more easily disposed of and thus less of a hazard than the pollutant was when it was in the air, right? So that's the goal. A final disposition is required, and we want the final disposition to be the least hazardous option possible. Certainly when we think about engineering controls, we have to recognize that it's important for us to effectively control emissions. We have to first capture them. And you can see here in these slides, these are some slides I took when I was at various metal processing facilities. The foundry on the left, if you can see this, you can see this fume, which is a metal fume. It's not steam. This metal fume is not being captured by the hood at the top of the kiln. It's being released to the environment. If you're not capturing the fume and you're releasing it to the environment, you're not controlling that particular hazard. In the slide on the right, this is a smelter. That's a secondary smelter burning waste metal. And you probably can't see it too well, but this engineering control device was also not working very well, releasing fume to the environment, thus exposing the two workers who were pouring the metal into these billets. In order to control the emissions, you have to effectively capture them, which of course requires proper engineering and likely required engineer in terms of design. Another engineering control, this is an example of a facility that cuts cement blocks. As you may know, cement contains a significant amount of crystalline silica, which means it does need to be controlled. In this particular case, you have a ventilation system. This ductwork going from the saws, capturing the pollutants and bringing it to this device on the left of the picture, which is fans that are pulling this material through bags. The bags are filtering the air, thus removing the pollutant before it's emitted to the atmosphere. The bags work by, when they start to get clogged, the device shakes the bag, shaking the dust that is accumulated on the bag into these hoppers at the bottom. And you're removing the air pollutant from the airstream, therefore you have cleaner air. You just have these two hoppers at the bottom that you have to cap off and dispose of the captured dust as solid waste. It's important to understand how these systems work so that they're working properly. In this particular case, if you do not remove the filter cake that builds up on these filters, the bags are going to stop working properly. They're going to stop filtering the air. If I do not control or design the ductwork properly, it's possible that I might not be able to carry the pollutants from the cutting saw into the bag house, therefore not controlling or capturing the air pollutants. So you do have to maintain these and operate control devices properly, which means that while they can be very effective, they do need to be maintained and operated properly. Otherwise, they could become very ineffective. Another example is packed tower. This basically is vapor and gas control system where basically you have the vapors and gases coming into the bottom of this device. Within the device, you have this packing material. There's liquid flowing through this packing material, coming in good contact with the air. And you design this so that the air pollutants or the gases and vapors that you're trying to remove are soluble in the liquid you're putting through this packed tower. Gets absorbed into the liquid, thereby removed from the airstream, and then you either have to treat the liquid or dispose of the liquid in a sewer. Hopefully that's less of a hazard than keeping the gas and vapor in the air. So this is why this device is utilized to remove the pollutant from the airstream so that you can control those exposures. Again, complicated devices can be very expensive, can be very effective, but they do have to be operated properly. One of the things we think about when we think about engineering controls is we oftentimes want to think about, on a very simple level, we want to think about removal efficiency. We want to determine how effectively we're actually removing the air contaminants from the airstream. And a simple calculation for removal efficiency is input minus output divided by input. Basically gives you the percent removal efficiency. We're going from a source of air pollutant to a control device to then whatever is left in the air is going to be in the atmosphere and be exposed to people breathing it in. The input mass is how much I'm inputting into the control. The output mass is how much is coming out of the control device, right? And that's how I can calculate my removal efficiency. Obviously, if I'm evaluating my control device, I want to be sure that I have a very efficient and the highest removal efficiency that I can attain for the resources that I have, right? In this particular example, this battery manufacturer melts these lead hogs in the picture on the left. that generates a lot of metal fume. That metal fume is then removed by this baghouse in the center, such that hopefully anybody working in the plant or people living in the community around this plant are not exposed to lead fume. And one of the ways we evaluate that is we design our control devices, our engineered control devices, to have a high removal efficiency. So for example, if I have a source that generates 100 pounds per hour and you have a control device in place, stack test shows that I have 100 pounds per hour going into the control device. I have 10 pounds per hour coming out, right? What's my removal efficiency? In this case, it would be 90%, right? So we want our removal efficiencies when we're talking about engineering controls to be as high as possible. So the next control strategy in the hierarchy of controls after engineering controls are administrative controls. Administrative controls refers to an approach where you adjust the way the work is done in such a manner so that you can reduce exposures and therefore reduce the hazards people are exposed to. Or you change the way things are done in a community such that you reduce the hazards and exposures. So the most clear example is in a workplace, you change how a job is done such that it becomes a safer work practice. The advantage of this is that it generally can be very inexpensive and may be easy to implement, and it can be effective at reducing exposures below acceptable levels. However, the disadvantage of this is that for these administrative controls to work, community members and workers must follow the established protocol or practice. They must be educated and appreciate the need to follow the established protocol or practice. And therefore, compliance is really important. The disadvantage of this technique is that 100% compliance is often difficult to attain. Oftentimes, there will be people in a community at work that will not follow the proper procedure or process, thereby reducing the effectiveness of the administrative control. So that's one of the disadvantages to this approach, is it really does require compliance of people in the community or at work in order for this to really work. You do have to put some resources into outreach and education so people understand why this is important and that they know how to follow the proper protocol and procedure. And also the other disadvantage of this approach is that it doesn't really eliminate the hazard, it just really manages it. So if people don't follow the necessary protocol or procedure, they're going to be exposed to the hazard, and therefore this could potentially not be particularly effective. Example, heat stress. Essentially, these are some of the recommendations that are recommended by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. This is where individuals utilize various procedural techniques with the way that they do their work, which includes things like limiting time in the heat, reducing the demands of a job if at all possible, utilizing tools to minimize manual strain, taking breaks, having a buddy system, making sure you have plenty of fluids. Sort of the process of work is done in a way that it reduces the risks from overexposure to heat and heat stress. These are some recommendations. This is just following up on water, rest, shade. You know, the way that you do the work, you drink plenty of water, you get rest, you take rest breaks, and you get as much shade as possible. This is the way that you're doing the work is in a manner that it reduces the risk. And these are these administrative controls. So another control is personal protective equipment, or PPE. This is where an individual utilizes the tools or equipment that can be worn by a person to provide a barrier between the pollutant and the individual. These are things like gloves or respirators and so on that one could utilize to prevent exposure and therefore reduce the risk or control the risk associated with a potential exposure. While it's true these are most commonly used in occupational environments, they have been applied to community settings as well. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, people utilized masks in the community to try to reduce the potential spread of COVID-19 among people in the communities. For some additional details on personal protective equipment, this link that you see on the slide will be provided on the course page, and you can go to the course page to click on this link and get detailed information about personal protective equipment. This will be provided on the course page, and I encourage you to go to the course page and look at this link. You'll find very helpful information related to personal protective equipment. Advantage of personal protective equipment is that they can be utilized when no other control method is available. They do prevent or at least reduce the internal dose someone would receive upon being exposed to a given chemical or contaminant. And the cost can be really modest, and in some cases, it might not be that difficult to implement. The disadvantage is that it does require training. Some personal protective equipment, like respirators, require personalized fit. You may have to do some testing, maintenance, cleaning, and so on to be able to utilize PPE properly. One of the real challenges of PPE and why it is at the bottom of the hierarchy of controls is that it does require compliance by the individuals who are using it. And it requires that people actually do use it. For example, some people at times may not use given personal protective equipment because They don't understand why it's important, or the personal protective equipment, they may find it's less comfortable. So they might not use the personal protective equipment. Certainly if the personal protective equipment is not being used, it's not going to be very effective. This is why this is considered your last option, or the least desirable option in terms of hazard control, risk control, exposure control, simply because it's not uncommon for people to not use them or not use them properly. Also, protection factors, or the equipment has to provide enough protection depending on the exposures one might encounter. It is possible to have such high exposures that you may need to use a more highly protective device. For example, this is why firefighters wear self-contained breathing apparatus when they go into a fire, because their exposures are so enormously high that an N95 or a little paper mask isn't going to give them enough protection entering a fire, and that's why they have to use SCBAs. Plus, they could be entering an environment that's low in oxygen, which is also why a mask would not provide them with proper protection. So protection factors have to be high enough for the exposures one expects to encounter, and they also have to be proper protective equipment for the given scenario that one is being exposed to, as in the case of the firefighters that I just mentioned. Here are some examples of PPE. You can see here the slide, yellow Tyvek suits with SCBAs. This is when our guys, I used to work in New Jersey, and this is where we had to go in and sample the post office that was contaminated with anthrax spores back in 2001. And of course, because anthrax can be a deadly disease and can have really serious health impacts with infection, we had to have a very high level of protection when we were going into that facility to collect samples and evaluate the contamination in that facility. These are just individuals who are working on as road crews. There's a lot of crystalline silica in the cement that they're grinding up. You can see here they have to wear half-face respirators. This provides them with enough protection for them to reduce their exposures to crystalline silica that might be in the concrete that is becoming airborne in this dust that you see in this picture on the right. And certainly wearing gloves in a healthcare environment is another real simple example of something pretty simple to use that is widely used in a healthcare setting to protect people from exposure to bodily fluids and so on. Another example that I want to point out, as I mentioned in the prior slides, is that when we talk about respirators, there are assigned protection factors. And the key thing I want to use this as an example for is that different personal protective equipment has different protective factors. Some are better than others. And you can clearly see this. If you look at this table on the right and you look at the pictures, we have half and full face respirators in the pictures of the individuals wearing these respirators. But you will notice that when you look at the assigned protection factors, the key point I want to make is that the protection factors are different for different types of respirators. Some respirators are more protective than others. For example, full face respirator has a higher protection factor compared to half or quarter masks. They have different protection factors. So the key point here is different personal protective equipment gives different levels of protection, and this must be matched to the exposure that one might expect to encounter. For example, you'll see here listed on the slide, a full-face respirator has an assigned protection factor of 50. A half mask assigned protection factor is only 10, which means that someone who's wearing this respirator would have 5 times more exposure while using a half mask compared to a full face mask. Right? So different respirators provide different levels of protection. The key point here is the respirators are a very good example of this. Different personal protective equipment gives different levels of protection, and you have to be sure that the level of protection that your personal protective equipment is giving you is appropriate for the exposures you might expect. Another example that I don't have here on the slide, but I should mention, this applies to gloves too. Whatever gloves you're wearing, they have to be impermeable to the chemical you're handling. If you're wearing gloves that's made of a material that can be dissolved by the solvent you're handling, that glove is not going to give you very much protection. You may end up dissolving the glove right off your hand, right? So we have to make sure when we use gloves that we use the right glove for the right chemical. We had an issue with a solvent that was widely used. We did a study on 1-bromopropane, which turns out it dissolves natural rubber. If you wear natural rubber gloves when you're handling that particular solvent, it's going to dissolve the glove on your hand while you're handling it. Again, not giving you very much protection. So different PPE gives different levels of protection and has to be chosen depending on the specifics of the scenario that one is going to encounter, the types of chemicals and the types of exposures that you're going to have. So again, just to summarize different control strategies, hierarchy of controls provides the framework that we utilize to select the controls that we select to control the risks and exposures that one may encounter. And this includes elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE in that order. going from most effective to least effective. But again, sometimes we have to use lesser effective controls because that's the only thing that's practical. Variation does exist in the effectiveness, cost, and implementation difficulty. Different control strategies give different levels of protection. We must fit our control strategy to the specific scenario that we are looking to control. And there are likely multiple factors that impact selection of control approaches, including resources, budgets, acceptability by those affected, as well as technical factors as well. So this is important for us to think about, and this is sort of just a summary of the control strategy module.